My name is Denise Allen, and I'm a curator at the Frick Collection, and I'd like to thank you all for coming on this beautiful summer night that is probably reflective of the world in Bellini's painting. Before I begin, I have a couple housekeeping things. The first is, could you please, if you have not done so already, turn off your cell phones or any other handheld devices that you may have on your person. Please do it during my introduction. I don't mind if I hear ringing during that time at all. The second thing is, and this is probably more important, Susannah Rutherglen, who will speak tonight, will take questions in front of the Bellini painting after the lecture. So any of you who have questions, please save them and walk into the Oval Room. They're best addressed before the picture. Now, tonight it gives me great pleasure to introduce Susannah Rutherglen, Andrew Mellon Curatorial Fellow at the Frick Collection, who will give the third and final lecture in the series dedicated to the dossier exhibition on Bellini's St. Francis. I should let you know that all the lectures in the Bellini series can be viewed in full online. If you go to the multimedia page on the Frick website and go to Art Babel, from there you will find them. Now, the first in the series lectures was by Keith Christensen, who explored the picture's subject and meaning. In the second, Charlotte Hale, paintings conservator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, presented the discoveries made during the technical examination of the picture when it was at the Met. Tonight, Susannah Rutherglen will consider the much broader topic of how Venetian Renaissance pictures, intended for domestic settings in the main, were used and displayed during the time of their making. Susannah's lecture reflects the research she has undertaken for her dissertation at Princeton University under the direction of Professor Patricia Fortini Brown. Susannah's contextual approach is vital to our field because it reveals the astonishing variety of creative ways 15th and 16th century paintings were embedded in the rich fabric of Venetian visual culture. Susannah's work promises to help us all to understand these pictures not only as masterpieces that embellish museum galleries, but also as objects that vibrantly express the customs and cultural practices of their time. Susannah's research will also provide another essential element to furthering our understanding of Bellini's St. Francis, a painting whose original location, function, and subject are still unknown. As a Mellon Fellow, Susannah was given charge of curating the Bellini Focus exhibition. The presentation of the picture in the Oval Room and the video narratives in the Media Room, which are a first for the Frick, are the fruits of her efforts. On this project, Susannah worked with the guidance of Charlotte Hale and collaborated with internationally respected scholars, as well as with the Frick's videographer, Lisa Candidge. But all of those of us who were involved in the project agree that the intellectual integrity and sheer beauty of the Bellini presentations here are due to Susannah's remarkable contributions as a scholar and a curator. It is Susannah who ideated the visual narratives that speak to us in lyrically measured cadences that encourage us all to appreciate the genius of this picture and to explore it anew. Now, I stand before you as one of among the large and fastly growing number who consider it both a privilege and a pleasure to name Susannah Rutherglen as a colleague. Please join me in welcoming Susannah for her lecture, Bellini to Veronese, Ornamental Paintings of the Venetian Renaissance.
Well, thank you to Denise for her introduction and for all her guidance during my time at the museum. and for sharing so much of her time and erudition with me. I'd also like to thank the Mellon Foundation and Colin Bailey and Susan Galassi for the opportunity to work here, and my graduate advisor, Patricia Fortini-Brown. Also, thank you to Charlotte Hale and Michael Bodycomb for their assistance with this presentation, and thank you to my family. From Giovanni Bellini to Paolo Veronese and beyond, the Frick collection is one of the richest assemblies of Venetian art in America. In addition to housing 2 masterpieces that appear in every major survey of Venetian painting, Bellini's St. Francis, now on view in the Oval Room, and the portrait of an anonymous noble youth known to Henry Clay Frick as the Red Cap Titian, the museum counts among its treasures one of the earliest pictures belonging to a recognizably Venetian school, the coronation of the Virgin signed by the 14th century master Paolo Veneziano and his son Giovanni. In addition, there are official likenesses of doges and men of letters, grand allegorical canvases, bronze sculptures from Venice and nearby Padua, landscape drawings, including this work attributed by some to Titian, and the 18th century Veduta tradition represented on the right wall of the refurbished East Gallery by Guardi's view of the Giudecca Canal, and culminating in the pastels and etchings of James McNeill Whistler, an American expatriate who is captivated by the crepuscular splendor of Venice over 500 years after the age of Paolo Veneziano. The Frick is an outpost of Venice in another sense as well, and that is in its commingling of painting, sculpture, and the decorative arts within a domestic setting to create an impressive aesthetic unity. The marriage of a furnished house for living with a museum for looking was much inspired by the display of J.P. Morgan's collection of paintings and decorative arts at the Metropolitan Museum beginning in 1914. And it was intended from the beginning. Thomas Hastings' 1916 plan for the ground floor of Henry Clay Frick's new home already includes a provisional arrangement of schools to be hung in each room: English in the library, Italian, German, and Spanish in the living hall, Fragonard in the drawing room, and so on. Today, as Frick intended, works of painting and sculpture are juxtaposed with polished wood and rich fabric, flowers, grotesque carvings, and glass, among other materials. The highly orchestrated presentation of objects of diverse kinds in an artful series of domestic spaces reflects the conditions in which many of the Venetian old masters at the Frick have historically been seen, as evidenced by this famous narrative painting of circa 1506, in which a devotional picture is embedded in a rich Venetian interior. Indeed, some of the very first house museums in the Frick mold can be traced to Renaissance Venice. This is the former home of the 16th century collector Gabriele Vendramin at Santa Fosca, described by an early source as the meeting place of all the virtuosi of the city. In Titian's portrait of the Vendramin family, Gabriele is most likely the brown-haired, bearded man wearing a crimson velvet gown lined with lynx fur and gesturing outwards with his right hand. Like Frick, Gabriele was a businessman, not a prince or a pope. He made his fortune manufacturing soap. And like Frick, he built a conspicuously inconspicuous mansion to house his treasures, which included Giorgione's Tempesta. And like Frick, he embedded this masterpiece in a room full of other objects, including ancient sculptures, lamps, vases, books, porcelain, a rhinoceros horn, and an animal's tooth. Unfortunately, the comparison between Vendramin and Frick breaks down in the afterlife. Whereas the Frick collection has enjoyed extraordinary stewardship ever since its founder's death, Vendramin's heirs, his 7 nephews highlighted here, squandered their uncle's fortune, and they tried to sell off the collection against the explicit wishes of Gabriel, who, like Frick, saw his collection as a work of art unto itself and wished for his treasures to remain intact and together, rhino horn and all. In a twist worthy of Henry James, the ghost of Gabriel Vendramin briefly got his wish when the entire collection was sealed inside the house, like the contents of a pharaonic tomb, while its fate was under arbitration. Gabriel has a direct personal link to the Frick. His brother-in-law and next-door neighbor was Taddeo Contarini, who by 1525 was the proud owner of our very own St. Francis. Like Frick, Taddeo had a reputation as a ruthless businessman with unsurpassed taste. According to a 16th century inventory, St. Francis hung in one of the first rooms of the Contarini family house in a gilded frame. As today, it was accompanied by Venetian pictures of other genres, including one work described as, quote, a figure of a woman, akin to, or very possibly identical with, Bellini's Lady with a Mirror, now in Vienna. Elsewhere in the house was Giorgione's Three Philosophers, which shares a number of affinities with St. Francis. Both picture surfaces have been cut down. The paintings contain a cave and an evocative landscape. Rays of light play a prominent role in the pictorial drama, and their subject matter is elusive. Seeing these two pictures side by side reminds us that Bellini's St. Francis is the first full-fledged example of the Venetian Renaissance poesia, a poetical picture on a grand scale that looks forward to the achievements of Giorgione and Titian in the 16th century. Like the Vendramin Palace, the Contarini home was a casa museo, enriched by luxury objects and linens, as well as books on the humanities and philosophy. So already by the 1520s, about 40 to 50 years after it was painted, Bellini's masterpiece of spiritual poetry hung in proximity to secular images, as well as to furnishings and accoutrements of living, much as it does today. Granted, there were no Louis XIV-style commodes flanking this picture in the Contarini collection as there are now in the Frick. However, the spirit of his gallery is still faithfully evoked by the customary presentation of these objects together in the living hall. Renaissance Venice is obviously not the only city in history in which different media have come together in rich domestic ensembles. But it is the quintessential example of such a city because its entire urban setting has been fabricated by human hands, the very ground built out of the lagoon in wood, brick, and stone. In a place where everything is artifice, boundaries between and relationships among the arts take on a particular interest. And appreciating this dimension of the city, as the Frick allows us to do, makes it possible to consider a lesser-known genre of painting in its proper context. Many pictures of the Venetian Renaissance were not merely juxtaposed with interior objects of other kinds, but were physically incorporated into such objects as ornaments. This category includes famous works that now hang in conventional galleries devoted exclusively to painting. Titian's Christ and the Pharisee belongs to Dresden's Gemäldegallery Alte Meister, seen here in an etching in aquatint of 1830, packed floor to ceiling with nothing but framed pictures. But Titian's work actually once belonged to another object, the door of a cabinet containing a collection of coins and medals in the palace of Duke Alfonso d'Este at Ferrara, perhaps similar to this reconstruction of the picture embedded in the 16th century armoire. In 1559, a servant of the court wrote down instructions for using this space. Quote, "Go to the studio of medals, and once you have entered, look above the fireplace, where you will find a key to the door on which Signor Jesus is portrayed by the hand of Titian. When this portrait is removed, there are some small drawers inside. We can guess that this door belonged to a rather large piece of furniture because an earlier inventory records that it contained over 3,000 coins and medals, likely similar to these surviving examples of the Sestertius and Aureus of the Emperor Nero. To take another example, just a few years ago, the trial of Moses and judgment of Solomon from the Circle of Giorgione were found to contain ad hoc painted designs and wood damage on their reverses, which indicate that the works originally functioned as doors or shutters supported by horizontal battens. These segments have been removed, leaving spaces of exposed wood near the top of each panel. And there's also wood damage associated with hinges. Several other Venetian Renaissance paintings known to have functioned as doors or shutters display similar features. Giorgione's beautiful Judith had traces of hinges and a keyhole before its transfer to canvas, indicating that it too once served as a door. The range of furniture in Renaissance Venice that could support painted decorations included not only doors, but also beds. These canvases by Andrea Schiavone once adorned a bed in the home of the sculptor Alessandro Vittoria. Chests, for example, this group of panels belonging to an impressive series of 7 wooden chests in the 17th century collection of the Duke of Buckingham, and musical instruments, including this octave spinet whose interior lid bears a painted decoration of an Orpheus-type figure. 2 of the greatest Venetian artists represented at the Frick, Giovanni Bellini and Paolo Veronese, were involved in this genre of decorative painting, and in fact are its bookends. Bellini was the author of this early ornamental panel entitled Bacchus, and Veronese was the culminating master in this tradition. His small picture of the allegory of painting probably belonged to a cycle of at least 17 canvases arranged around the upper walls of a room as a decorative frieze, while Bellini's Bacchus formed part of a group of small pictures signed by the artist and attached to a domestic mirrored hanging rack called a rastello. This aspect of Bellini's and Veronese's production receives little notice from art historians and museum goers, partly because the painting's original settings have long been lost, and partly due to ingrained prejudices originating in antiquity and perpetuated from the Renaissance to our own day against what are known as the decorative or applied arts. In 1548, for example, the theorist Paolo Pino wrote that artists, quote, stoop to painting furniture, end quote, only when they cannot win larger and more prestigious commissions. Like Pino, we have been trained to think of a true painting as a framed masterpiece hanging in glorious isolation on the wall, not as an element of a useful object. Yet the Frick offers a lesson in the importance of considering painting and the decorative arts together, for you can't understand one without the other. To take 2 examples, these sets of fragments represent 2 of the earliest surviving examples of Venetian ornamental painting by Cima da Conegliano, a slightly younger contemporary of Bellini. They're usually dated about a decade apart and likely adorned objects similar to this gilded chest now in Milan. The primary challenge involved in studying paintings of this type is reconstructing their original configurations from individual scattered pieces that have been substantially altered over time. Here's one sample reconstruction of the Bacchus and Ariadne cycle. While the specifics of their setting may be elusive, the panels' extremely small scale, their style, and the nature of their damages secure their identification as fragments of painted furniture decoration. The 2 groups center on the life of King Minos' daughter, Ariadne, and 2 of her suitors, Theseus and Bacchus. The works thus represent some of the first examples of full-fledged classical mythological narrative in Venetian painting. At the turn of the 16th century in Venice, classical subjects were not within the purview of monumental art, but were confined to marginal and subsidiary contexts, such as furniture decoration. Cima himself was primarily a painter of religious works, which constituted the genre of highest prestige at that time. A mythological painting of the scale and prominence of the artist John the Baptist altarpiece would have been inconceivable in this period. Ornamental art, by virtue of its lesser status, provided an arena for artistic license and experimentation, including the first elaboration in Venetian panel painting of the fables of antique poets. The surviving elements of Cima's earlier group, dated circa 1497, chronicle the arrival of the hero Theseus at the palace of King Minos of Crete, where he greets the king in the foreground and in the background receives from Ariadne the ball of thread with which he will find his way through the legendary labyrinth. An adjacent, smaller panel depicts the hero within the labyrinth, preparing to slay the Minotaur. Cima must have found inspiration for this novel subject in the antiquarian culture of Venice's elite, who filtered their knowledge of archaeology, epigraphy, history, and literature through a collective poetic imagination. The island of Crete, the legendary kingdom of Minos, was a colony of the Venetian maritime empire beginning in the 13th century. On this island, the famous maze-like complex of natural caves at Gortina had long conjured associations with the mythical labyrinth of the Minotaur. Enterprising magistrates from Venice had toured the Gortina cave formations as early as the 1420s, and the caves were identified with this fabled antique prison as late as the mid-17th century. This Dutch map describes the site as the labyrinth and includes a circular diagram similar to the design of the labyrinth in Cima's painting. The Gortina formations belonged to Venice's vast network of trade and exploration, allowing Venetians to claim the topography of Theseus's adventures for their own. In his decorative cycle, Cima embraced the myth within the city's distinctive visual idiom as well, evoking the legend of Theseus in the labyrinth for the first known time in Venetian panel painting. To represent a theme for which little precedent existed, the artist skillfully appealed to diverse sources. Young Theseus wears a knightly costume similar to those seen in Bellini's Resurrection. The hero kneels before Minos in a scene reminiscent of the reception of the ambassadors from Carpaccio's narrative cycle for the Confraternity of St. Ursula. The representation of Minos and members of his retinue in turbans and rich robes suggests an imaginative identification of the ancient past with the Islamic East, and recalls the Mamluk costumes in Cima's own Healing of Anianus, dated to around the same period. For the multicolored architecture of the palace courtyard, Cima looked to the style of the Lombardo workshop, and especially the recently completed revetment of the Church of Santa Maria dei Miracoli. The partially ruined labyrinth in the smaller panel rhymes with the illustrations of the 1497 vernacular printed edition of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The artist apparently read Ovid's text carefully as well, and included identifying details such as the gnarled club of Theseus protruding from the stomach of the Minotaur. In other respects, however, he departed from the symbolism of literary sources. The Minotaur does not represent the bull-headed monster of tradition, but is an innocuous centaur, half man, half horse, perhaps inspired by manuscript illuminations or the creature in the background of Bellini's Sacred Allegory. During the Renaissance, the Minotaur and the centaur were often conflated. They appear together in the 12th canto of Dante's Inferno. Cima's substitution of one creature for the other, as well as his whimsical and imaginative rendering of the story as a whole, reveal his concern for the spirit rather than the letter of the antique tale. A second ornamental cycle by the artist, dated circa 1505 to 10, depicts a contiguous event, the union of Bacchus and Ariadne, after he has rescued her from abandonment by Theseus on the Isle of Naxos. This theme suggests that the chest may have commemorated a marriage, although we have no information about the commission. The central scene shows Bacchus crowning his bride in their triumphal car, which is drawn by panthers wearing harnesses of red leather with golden hoops and studs. A satyr wearing grapevines walks alongside, and the bacchant at rear, with his goat-like face, carries a basket of grapes of varying ripeness. In the second fragment, Silenus rides his donkey, two satyrs eye his wine-filled gourd, while in the background appears the ship of the deadbeat Theseus. And here are two final surviving fragments. Together, these scenes represent a very early elaboration of the story of Bacchus and Ariadne in Venetian panel painting. As we have seen, ornamental fields offered a proving ground for such novel subjects, and in fact, the earliest surviving representation of the wine god Bacchus in Venetian painting appears in Giovanni Bellini's allegories that we saw earlier, which depict Bacchus crowned with grape leaves and riding his chariot. It did not take long, however, for the artistic potential of such themes to be recognized and for patrons to begin requesting them in independent works. By 1523, Titian had completed his monumental version of the Bacchus and Ariadne theme for the famous Camerino of Alfonso d'Este at Ferrara. Titian's canvas is over 6 times as tall as the panels we've just seen, yet it shows substantial points of contact with these early examples, particularly Cima's narrative. Both ensembles depict the ship of Theseus departing, and in Titian's version, the beautiful torsion of Ariadne's figure shows her simultaneously palming the sky as she reaches for the vanishing vessel and locking eyes with the newly arrived Bacchus. Both paintings include the triumphal car of Bacchus, decorated with foliage, and the two cars are drawn by exotic animals, panthers in Cima and cheetahs in Titian, evoking Bacchus's journey from the east. And here it's worth noting that both artists conflate two different episodes of the arrival of Bacchus: his initial rescue of Ariadne after Theseus's departure, and his second homecoming from India, where he had been up to no good after the couple had already been united. Both works include Silenus on his donkey. Both depict satyrs, and both include a bacchant bringing up the rear with a barrel or basket of wine, in Titian's painting barely visible in the background at right. And both depict the crowning of Ariadne, Cima's version by the wreath Bacchus places on her head, and Titian's by the constellation in the sky, recalling Bacchus's words according to Ovid: "As a reward I offer you the heavens, as a new star your glittering crown shall serve as a guide to the uncertain navigator." In other words, the paintings share an incipient iconography of the triumph of Bacchus, drawn from literary descriptions of this subject by Ovid, Catullus, and others, and also from visual exempla, such as ancient sarcophagi, contemporary sculpture, including the satyrs carved on the tomb of Doge Andrea Vendramin, and works on paper, including drawing books and engravings. The affinities between Titian's and Cima's versions of the story do not mean that the younger artist used Cima directly as a source. In fact, the mood and style of the pictures are completely different. Nonetheless, a more complete understanding of Titian's masterpiece requires accounting for its predecessors, and by the same token, we can appreciate Cima's ornamental cycle more fully by considering its innovative role in the tradition of painted mythologies in Venice. For a coda to this history, if we look to the end of the 16th century, the triumph of Bacchus and Ariadne constitutes the centerpiece of Annibale Carracci's frescoes on the ceiling of the Galleria Farnese. This composition was likely inspired, at least in part, by Titian's own Bacchus and Ariadne, which had been confiscated from the Estensi and entered the possession of a prominent cardinal in Rome by the autumn of 1598, and which Carracci would have been able to see through the intercession of a well-placed friend. As Rudolf Wittkover has argued, Carracci's choice to place this episode in a monumental fictive frame reflected his belief that, quote, the mythological representation as belonging to the highest class of painting should be rendered objectively and in isolating frames. The artist's apotheosis of Bacchus and Ariadne at the focal point of a major fresco program, similar to the position of the creation of Adam and Eve in the Sistine Chapel, reveals how completely this poetic theme had migrated from the margins to the center of Italian painting. Returning to the early example of Bacchus in Venetian ornamental art, Bellini's four allegories in the Accademia. In his will of 1525, the artist Vincenzo Catena mentioned his Rastello of walnut with certain little figures inside, painted by the hand of Mr. Giovanni Bellini. The Accademia paintings almost certainly once belonged to an object of a similar type, a mirrored hanging rack with hooks for toiletries, brushes, and other items. We can infer that the allegories are decorative paintings because of their small size and because their support is composed of hardwood, probably beech. This material is very delicate and rarely found in picture supports from the Bellini workshop, but it's consistent with paintings belonging to a small piece of furniture. For example, these two surviving Venetian coffers are made partially or wholly of beech. The Accademia panel's original thickness, only 3 to 4 millimeters each, further suggests that they belong to furniture, and one of the supports still contains intact pins which would have been used as guides to insert the panel into this setting. In addition to including an early depiction of Bacchus, the panels anticipate related strains of secular painting in 16th century Venice. The panel, generally called Truth, depicts a standing woman elevated on a pedestal surmounted by a drum. She holds and gestures toward a mirror and is surrounded by musical children. In Venice, this is a very early surviving example of an independent panel painting of the nude female figure, which was to become a subject of great importance to the city's artists during the next 100 years. The only prior known work of this type is a picture of Venus recorded in the bedroom of a prominent nobleman by the humanist Raffaele Zovenzoni in a manuscript of poems dated around 1474. This painting no longer survives and may have been lost at an early date, but it likely hung on or near the bed, as did many subsequent portrayals of Venus and the nude in Venetian homes. The evidence suggests, therefore, that this theme in its first unfolding was associated primarily with domestic, decorative, and furniture settings. However, Bellini's Truth is very rarely discussed in studies of the Venetian nude. Perhaps this is due to her apparently chaste and unclassical appearance. The artist's sources for this standing, attenuated figure probably lay in northern prototypes, such as Jan van Eyck's Eve at the upper right-hand corner of the Ghent altarpiece. Bellini's invention is also similar to the late Gothic statue of Eve by Antonio Rizzo for the Arco Foscari in the courtyard of the Palazzo Ducale in Venice. We know that Rizzo and Bellini were acquainted because the sculptor collaborated with Bellini's brother on a pulpit for the Confraternity of San Marco. The placement of Truth, like a sculpture in a niche, suggests that Bellini may even have been looking directly at Rizzo's model. Though the gesture of Rizzo's Eve is inspired by the ancient type of the modest Venus, Her elongated figure displays medieval and northern canons of proportion and seems completely unrelated to the later tradition of classically inspired, voluptuous women in paintings of Giorgione, Titian, Tintoretto, and even Bellini himself. The artist's Lady with a Mirror that we saw earlier is antique in cast, recalling and implicitly rivaling a famous painting by the ancient artist Apelles, while the Dresden Venus of circa 1507 evokes ancient visual exempla of the slumbering Ariadne and other dormant beauties, as well as Latin nuptial poetry. However, differences of style and sources between Bellini's Truth and later Venetian nudes do not rule out common intentions and responses. In the 15th century, the Flemish and late Gothic ideal of the female form, as exemplified by Truth and Rizzo's Eve, was considered highly sensual and provocative, even by 15th century humanists such as Zovenzoni. He addressed a poem to Rizzo's statue, declaring, quote, "If your beauty were as it lives in this marble, Eve, who would be surprised if man submitted to you?" To Zovenzoni, the female form as realized by Rizzo was not merely beautiful, but the very source of original sin. We can infer that Bellini's Truth was understood similarly by early viewers, its connotations of love and fertility heightened by the presence of children and the strange male figure reflected in the protagonist's mirror. And indeed, the theme of the Lady with a Mirror also played a prominent role in Venetian art of the later Renaissance. These overtones would have suited a work displayed in a private setting and juxtaposed with three other poetic paintings in a Rastello holding a lady's cosmetic tools. Returning from the profane to the sacred, the Venetian tradition of ornamental paintings encompasses not only mythological and secular subjects, but also religious themes, as we've seen in works by Titian and Giorgione. Titian's picture is one of the earliest known representations in Italian painting of the tribute money story, the biblical episode in which the Pharisees sought to entrap Jesus by asking him if it were lawful to pay tribute to the Roman emperor. "What thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not?" This dangerous question put Jesus between a rock and a hard place: either admit the supremacy of Roman law over the land of Israel and deny the supremacy of God, or vice versa. Christ skillfully parried the question, demanding, "Show me the tribute money." Titian depicts the electric moment when one of the Pharisees slips the coin between his fingers. Jesus then asked whose image and superscription were found there, and the Pharisees identified them as the emperor's. Then saith he unto them, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." This ingenious response tacitly endorsed the payment of taxes to the emperor, while at the same time asserting the existence of a spiritual authority to whom such payments were meaningless. In Titian's image, the color of the coin matches the emanation of Christ's halo, suggesting the antithesis of his celestial aura and the base gold of earthly currency. The lesson is clear. He deals not in money, but in miracles. This episode bore special relevance for the patron of Titian's picture, Alfonso d'Este of Ferrara, who had adopted it as his personal emblem. He was the heir of a land grant from the Holy Roman Empire and, at the same time, Duke of the Papal Jurisdiction of Ferrara, here visible in fresco in the Vatican Gallery of Maps. In other words, Alfonso was subject to both empire and God, a political situation analogous to that of Christ in the tribute money story. Early in his reign, Alfonso minted several coins depicting his portrait on the obverse and the figures of Christ and the Pharisee, accompanied by the biblical quotation on the reverse, "And to God the things that are God's." Alfonso's appropriation of this passage was witty and disingenuous, for unlike Jesus, who faced a treacherous political and spiritual predicament, the Estensi had long used their divided allegiances to engineer virtually any situation to their benefit. And Titian only compounded the joke by painting this subject for the door of the Duke's cabinet of precious ancient coins. Now the tribute money story becomes a double entendre as Alfonso and his companions remove objects from the cabinet and repeat the words of Jesus. "Show me the tribute money. Whose is this image and superscription?" Only now in a spirit of antiquarian appreciation and historical interest. On some level, this usage is consistent with the biblical narrative in which Christ employs the coin as a visual aid to convey the meaning of his pronouncement and to enhance its impact on his audience. In the rarefied atmosphere of Alfonso's cabinet, too, the visual and the verbal were conjoined for pedagogical purposes. These coins were not mere money, but works of art and objects of study and wonder, cornerstones of the new Renaissance attitude to the past, which prized antique currency not for its material worth, but for its craftsmanship and historical value. And the extent to which Alfonso modeled his own persona on numismatic examples is suggested by his tribute money testone at right, which clearly echoes the composition of ancient imperial coins. These nuances are lost on us if we see Titian's painting only as an easel picture. But in fact, for most of its life, that's exactly what it has been. In 1598, the dual political allegiances of the Estensi finally caught up with them, and the Pope kicked them out of Ferrara. Titian's painting was detached from its furniture setting and moved to the city of Modena, where it joined the Royal Picture Gallery. In fact, every painting of this genre that we've considered today underwent a similar transformation. As late as the mid-17th century, Tintoretto's series of oblong panels depicting scenes from the Old Testament belonged to wooden chests in the home of the Duke of Buckingham. Today, however, they hang in frames alongside conventional easel pictures in Vienna's Gemälde Gallery. And Veronese's frieze cycle has been dispersed across museums on 3 continents, where its fragments hang as individual framed paintings. So I'll conclude today by considering how these works underwent a change in identity from embedded decorative elements to framed works of art. The removal of site-specific objects from their original locations for isolated display in museums is a familiar phenomenon. A classic example up the street being the Colonna altarpiece, which was painted by Raphael for a Franciscan church in Perugia, but is now seen in the Met as well as museums in Boston and Great Britain. The framing and independent display of secular ornamental pictures belongs to the same phenomenon, but it is also distinct by virtue of its documentation and interpretation in early sources. In 1648, the painter and writer Carlo Ridolfi included a lengthy discussion of Venetian furniture pictures in his biography of Giorgione. Ridolfi concluded his account of these objects by noting that several of the paintings had been detached from their ornamental settings and hung in a domestic gallery. 3 of these fables are with the Signori Wiedmann. In one is the birth of Adonis, in the second he's seen in sweet embraces with Venus, and in the third he's killed by the boar. And other examples likewise have been reduced to small pictures and placed in various studies. With this brief but telling conclusion, Ridolfi connects Venetian decorative paintings to developments in art appreciation from the 16th century down to his own day. The Wiedmann family, to whom he ascribed ownership of the 3 furniture pictures, were prominent collectors in Seicento, Venice. Of Austrian extraction, they had settled in the city during the 1500s and made their fortune in the metals trade. The architect of their palace was Baldassare Longhena, who also designed homes for the highest native nobility of Baroque Venice. And the palace contained a rich assembly of art. This portrait by Tiberio Tinelli depicts Lodovico, a scion of this nouveau riche family, who was active in the renovation and decoration of their palace. Although no paintings of Adonis associated with the Viedma survive, Ridolfi's account of these works is highly credible. He published precise and detailed descriptions of still extant canvases from the same gallery, now in Russia and Scotland, demonstrating that he had seen and studied the family's collection in person. In all likelihood, Ridolfi accurately refers to Georgianesque furniture paintings, perhaps similar to this slightly later work, hanging alongside easel pictures in the Viedma Palace. The paintings have been transformed from dependent decorative elements into autonomous pictures for a gallery setting. Furthermore, the custom is widespread rather than confined to a single ensemble, for, quote, others likewise have been modified in this way. And we see the same phenomenon in a catalog of the collector Andrea Vendramin, where detached decorative paintings hang alongside standard easel pictures. Many forces motivated these renovations, but the primary one was the differentiation of painting from other arts and the rise of the portable gallery picture as we understand it today, a two-dimensional image that can be enclosed in an ornamental border and hung anywhere on the wall, then packed flat or rolled for sale or transport. We tend to take the idea of the framed easel picture hanging on a museum wall for granted. In fact, however, it is an historical invention and has much to do with developments in the culture of the Renaissance and Baroque periods in Europe, where prominent royal collectors, such as Leopold Wilhelm of Austria, created some of the first modern picture galleries. And here we see a painting of Leopold Wilhelm's gallery, which includes at upper left Giorgione's Three Philosophers, which, as we've seen earlier, hung near the Frick St. Francis in the Taddeo Contarini collection. As former Mellon Fellow Xavier Solomon has shown, Veronese's two large canvases of the choice between virtue and vice and wisdom and strength here at the Frick were conceived from the beginning as portable gallery paintings of this new type. They were made without a specific setting in mind, but were intended to be sold together or separately as self-sufficient works of art on the burgeoning international market. Indeed, these were the first documented paintings by Veronese ever to leave Italy. They belonged at one point to Emperor Rudolf II of Prague and passed among a series of distinguished owners before being acquired by Henry Clay Frick in 1912. Whereas these canvases were conceived from the beginning as gallery paintings, the pictures we've seen today underwent a fundamental change in identity after they had been created and used, bringing them into line with the emergent ideal of the autonomous, pure painting. The works thus help us to understand the rise of the picture as an entity in European art. At the same time, however, they remind us that the independent painting and the work of decorative art are fundamentally connected. Indeed, we might say that the one defines the other. And there's no better place to consider this truth than the Frick collection, which has very much inspired my research on this subject. Thank you.